Okay, we're back again, and it's 11K, and we're focusing yet again on Commodus, and the idea is to show the keywords in each verse, and as we saw in 11J, echaritosen is really what this whole paragraph is about, and I was explaining some of the kinds of grace that were operating during this time that Paul is prophetically depicting by means of clever keywords, okay, and the meter. Now, this grace, as far as the Roman Empire was concerned, had a dark side. And this is true of humanity today and in any other period of history. So I got to spend a little bit of time on it. When people are like the Antonines were, especially Aurelius. Aurelius was really not a good guy. When people are, how do you want to call it, proud of the fact that they are good people, they cause more trouble than if they were bad people to start with. Commodus is a result of Aurelius. Commodus is a result of Aurelius being really proud of how much of a philosopher he was. Okay? Commodus comes to power with his dad when he's like 17. Okay? Aurelius dies at Plutus. And that's basically, Plutus kind of characterizes the problem that Commodus grew up with. Commodus is only 20 at this point. He's only going to live another 11 years, 10, 11 years. Okay? I believe that it said in the Augustan history that Commodus' birthday was the same as Nero's, and that's kind of appropriate because Commodus was a lot like Nero. He wasn't as bright as Nero. Okay? And he was weaker in his character even than Nero. But he had the same proclivities. He was killing a lot of people. He was, anything you want to call immoral, this guy did it, except that he was like Nero light. Okay? He wasn't as clever as Nero. And he left the running of empire to people that were in his confidence were really bad. And he didn't have any character about them either. He knew enough to know that they were ruining the empire. And he also knew enough to know to blame them, and so when the populace was all upset at them running the empire, he just made sure they got killed. He just threw them to the people. But he's 20 years old, okay? When you have a lot of money and you have a lot of excessive, wrong kind of attention from your parents, okay, you don't yet have enough of a character of your own to stand up to your background. And so you will go wacko for a while. That's true of everybody when they're in their 17, 20, 25 phase. Very, very rarely is there an individual who has enough personal character at that age, unless he goes through a lot of trauma early on. Very rarely does an individual have any sense of independence. Okay? Usually the way that people grow up fast and early is they have to have trauma. This didn't happen to Commodus. Alright? I mean, he went out on all the campaigns with his dad. And there was a lot of trauma that actually went on in the Roman Empire during this time, which I didn't cover. So the word grace here has this, kind of wry undertone about the pride that Aurelius had in his own stature, and everybody was praising him for it on top of that. Okay? He was so proud of being so good. And what that produced in him was a blindness. That's one of the dark sides of being proud of who you are, is that because you're so proud of who you are and you're so proud of being good, your discernment goes. And his discernment really wasn't all that good when it came to people around him. He made his brother co-emperor. He overlooked his wife's infidelity. Okay, and Commodus was growing up watching this. Okay, his mother was running around on his dad, and it was so bad that, remember I told you that the technique, the rhetorical style technique, is to take a word and make it apply in a wry way. Well, that's how the Roman and the Greek plays were worded. And they had a common Roman play going around at the time when Commodus was growing up. His wife, Faustina, was involved with a guy named Tertullus. Ter means three in Latin. Tullus, I forget what that means, okay? And so they had a play where this foolish guy is asking another foolish guy 3 times what was the name of the wife's lover. And the guy says, Tullus, Tullus, Tullus. Okay, and the audience knew that meant Tertullus, the lover of Faustina, the wife of Marcus Aurelius. So this was very commonly known. And it tells you a lot more about how I know that that's what Paul's doing here. That's the style of Greek and Roman drama. That's how they play games with words, and Shakespeare does the same thing. Okay, and I had Shakespeare in college, so did a lot of other people. Okay, so this guy is growing up amidst riches. He's growing up amidst a libertine mother, and he's, in the mother's house. Aurelius is, for the most part, busy attending to affairs of state. And Aurelius was so proud of his own goodness that he overlooks his brother, who was living like a libertine as soon as he could. And he overlooks his own son, who's doing the same thing from the get-go. Okay? I mean, there's another story about Commodus that when he was 12, his bath water wasn't hot enough, so he ordered the slave who was drawing his bath for him to be burnt. And the other slave who was supposed to execute the other, the slave drawing the water, instead burns a sheepskin to make Commodus think that he killed the slave that drew the bath water because of the fumes of the sheepskin burning. All right? So this is the kind of life that goes on around somebody who prides himself on how good he is, how good his morality is. Okay? Because he has to think he's good. That means he has to be too loyal to his brother and his wife. Okay, you're an emperor. You can't afford to have those kinds of loyalties. The state has to be your loyalty. When you rule, when you run a company, when you run a country, that has to be first. Or else you should just give up office. All right? Instead of doing that, he ends up, looking to the world like he's, involved in nepotism. He puts people in his family, and he overlooks their faults and their flaws and the damage they were doing to the empire. And that was what Aurelius was doing. He was not a good guy. And of course, he was persecuting Christians because they had they were competing. Because Christians were hung up on their morality at this time too. And, that's not Roman, and so he's got to get rid of anything that's not Roman. Okay, well, Commodus right down here is growing up under all that. I mean, this is the time starting right here at Dia 2. This is when Aurelius comes into power on his own, because this is when Pius dies. Pius dies here. Okay? So all during this time, that's the lifetime. Okay? Obviously, he had everything going for him. And yet Aurelius turned a blind eye, and Commodus grows up and sees that blind eye, sees what goes on, and he opts for the libertine side that he's been living with all of his life, which is, a grand total of 17 years at this point. He doesn't learn anything under his dad because he sees that his dad is, as far as he's concerned, a hypocrite. So to him, empire means, oh, I got all these toys to play with. And that's what he does. Okay? So the meaning now of this paragraph is a little bit deeper. All right? We got all this nastiness going on because the Christians aren't voting for God. All right? We got a guy who prides himself on his grace that he picks up from being a philosopher. Antoninus Pius, who really was a good administrator as far as I can tell. All right? And Aurelius was a good administrator too, but he was too hung up on, how good he was. And so all the riches that he had at his disposal and all of his misuse of aphasin, aphasin means to forgive a debt. It's usually just translated forgiveness. But that's not it. You have to know what kind of forgiveness it is. He's forgiving the debts of his brother. He's forgiving the debts of his wife. And he's overlooking Commodus' bad character as he's growing up very early. So he's overlooking the paraptomaton. He's overlooking the sins. And he's proud of himself for doing that. But he's running an empire. He should have done something. And as a result, he at least should not have appointed Commodus to take over. And at the end of his life, he realized he shouldn't have done that. But it was too late. Okay, he dies in Vienna. It takes him like a week to die, and he's all very melodramatic about his death. Calling in his friends and his family and then getting them out. And apparently he caught, which is the other thing that goes on during this period, the plague. There was a huge plague that started, let's see, this is when Ananias Pius dies. There's a period of chaimatos autou, that's 5 syllables. Ten, so at af, chaimatos autou, ten af. Just about here, starting in here, and it apparently kept going on. There was a pestilence in Rome that claimed a lot of lives, and it ended up being exported from Rome. Whatever the plague was, it ended up being exported from Rome to the places where the legions went. And Aurelius was traveling a lot. So people got sick all over the Roman world, but it was mostly centered in Rome. So again, the fact that God had banished, all right, and the fact that Aurelius was anti-Christian was a blessing. See, look at this. Grace, redemption, blessing. God's grace to Christians was, hi, I know there's this guy that's going to come up and going to pride himself on his grace, but he's going to hate Christians and persecute them. But if you get out of Rome, you're going to be okay, yeah. And you're going to be okay also because there's this big 7-year pestilence, maybe longer than 7 years, okay, that begins right here. For sure it lasts that long. All right? Pestilence that goes on in Rome. Not to mention the pestilential ruler who's going to come after it. Okay? So the fact that God's grace knows about all this stuff, this guy with his fake grace, raising a guy who's going to be a monster for 11 years, all in Rome is where most of the trouble was. And like I said, some of it got exported. And especially under the people that Commodus had ruling for him, they were robbing the provinces as well as they were raping Rome monetarily. They were selling everything, just anything you wanted to. If you wanted to be a procurator, then you could buy your office. I mean, it was just, I don't know how to explain it. It was a really, really low time. Okay. And so here's Commodus coming to the power at 17, coming into power at his own at 20, and rejecting what his dad had taught him, just as Aurelius' wife had rejected it, and just as Aurelius' brother had rejected it. Commodus was on their side of the fence. And God is providing grace to Christians so that the Roman Empire can continue living. Because by being booted out, by being, how you want to call it, persona non grata, in the Roman Empire, in Rome specifically, you could go to the provinces and be safe. God got them out of the pestilence. Now, that's the next thing about this grace. I'm showing all the expressions of this grace that's going on here, historically, as well as the fact that Paul is talking about our assets. All right? Is that the grace was, just like with the Exodus, and just like with Leviticus 26, pestilence is one of the promises in Leviticus 26, if you're not grown up in Christ. Okay? That was one of the responsibilities of the Jews, to learn and live on Scripture as they then knew it. That's Deuteronomy 31. And if they do that, God will give the world good weather, God will give them good crops, God will give them, defeat of their enemies, the whole bit. And if they don't do that, then all the things that He was giving them, He withholds. And so you have pestilence, you have invading armies, blah, blah, blah. That's exactly what happens from this point forward when Aurelius, it had been happening to some extent before, especially Trajan. Trajan had conquered a large amount of territory, and then Hadrian basically, negotiated to stop all those wars. And so the barbarians got the idea, Rome's weak now. So they started to break off and do whatever they wanted, including the Jews. And then that meant that Antoninus Pius had to get back involved in it, and he and Aurelius went out and started fighting again. They regained a lot of territory, and Aurelius ended up spending most of his life fighting. He was either fighting the plagues at home, or he was fighting the incursions of the barbarians. And that's all Leviticus 26 stuff. So the Christians who were living in and around Rome, or in the Roman Empire, weren't doing their job. They weren't learning Christ. So it culminated in a Commodus. Okay? So on the one hand, you see the grace of God moving the Christians out of Rome, okay? Redeeming them, redeeming the time, okay? Forgiveness. And then you see the dark side of Aphiemi, where the father of the empire forgives too much. So you see how all this whole thing forms kind of like a little play, with just as much cleverness as that play I told you about on Tertullus, where they mentioned Tullus 3 times to make an allusion to the lover of Aurelius's wife, Faustina. Okay? So those are the two sides of grace. There's the human claim of grace, which is no grace at all. It's just pride. Okay? And then there's real grace, which is God keeping you alive, and what's happening to you seems to be really bad. Because, Christians were badly treated during this time, unless they got out of Rome. Yeah, and that saved them from the pestilence that God hit the Romans with afterwards. And then came the pestilence of Commodus. So all that is riches too. Riches of God's provision. The riches of Leviticus 26 playing against as well as for. Because this was a nice time. In spite of the plague, in spite of a lot of things, this was a peaceful time in the Roman Empire, generally speaking. It was the incursions were by the barbarians on the borders. But for the most part, there was a whole lot of success against them. At the same time, you had the plague going on. Okay? And there were other disasters that occurred in Rome too. So Rome had a lot of disasters. That was to warn Aurelius, hi, you're not ruling well. Aurelius didn't take the hint. Okay? Meanwhile, there was forgiveness for everybody else. And at the same time, grace is also the expression of harshness. Okay? It's grace to get surgery. It's grace when the surgery succeeds. But surgery itself is harsh. It hurts. You're cutting into something. So that was basically Commodus. Now, Commodus ends up dying in 192. So his whole thing is like right here. That's Commodus. Debt cancellation for our transgressions for the riches of his grace. What would we say would be the key word for Commodus himself? Okay? Well, probably right here. That's about how he died too. Superabounds. The irony here is that Commodus was superabounding in every kind of bad thing you can do. I mean, every kind of sexual immorality you want to mention, he did it. Every kind of misrunning of empire, he did it. I mean, it would take me hours to explain all the things that he did wrong. So you're just going to have to go read up on him. What I can tell you immediately, though, is that the Commodus that's portrayed in the movie Gladiator is not this Commodus. I mean, the movie Gladiator was supposed to be based on Marcus Aurelius. Okay, and the Commodus that's mentioned, you know, all the character names are the same as Commodus and his sister, and the guy his sister was married to, and all that. I don't know if there was really a general Maximus that Commodus was, that Aurelius was close to, but that story is not like the real story. Okay, Commodus, like I said, was only 17 when he's co-crowned with his dad. All right, he's only 20 when he comes to power right in here. Okay, and he's a wacko. So superabound is his keyword. He superabounded in every kind of evil there was. Well, that gives us all more meaning. Just as much as Commodus is superabounding in his mismanagement of empire, and the empire's being raped, as it were, by the people that he put in charge, because he's off doing his little debaucheries. He's not paying attention to empire at all. And when he's not doing his debaucheries, he's ordering people to be killed in the Senate, and anybody noble, anybody he was jealous of. Very weak character. Okay? Commodus was busy superabounding in evil. God was busy superabounding in grace. And one of the grace aspects of this, again, is that because Commodus was so bad, but he was essentially staying in Rome most of the time. If you just stayed out of Rome, you could stay away from all this Ephesians, the superabounding of the evil that was going on. Just go where the doctrine is, which was out in the provinces, and, you know, ignore all the religiosity, because the Christians were fighting with each other and all very religious too. Okay, they were all competing with Marcus Aurelius for how good they were, but they were wacko too. Christianity was superabounding as well in wacko stories, wacko ideas, and of course this is where the what we call Catholicism became dominant. But again, Catholicism was just an amalgam of all the wacky ideas that went on during this time, and it became dominant. That's all. If it wasn't Catholicism that you know, superabounded, it would have been some other version of Christianity, because they were all wacko, every one of them. There was maybe, you know, 1% of Christians were actually learning Bible and living the spiritual life at this point. Okay? So, Ephesians characterizes Commodus, and he dies right here at the end of the verb. Susen. See, he gets killed. He's murdered right here. And then a guy named Pertinax, this is 192, a guy named Pertinax takes over. And from this point forward, you have a rulership of a sort of round-robin musical chairs, set of emperors, each one basically from the army or put up there into power by the army. And they don't last very long.